The key to making the whole process of sewing efficient is batching. Today I'm going to start filming a sewing tutorial for a super cool and interesting sewing pattern, the ME2066, and I thought it would be fun for me to take you a little behind the scenes and show you how my sewing happens in real time, because the sewing that happens in real time is actually going to be different from the sewing that happens in a sewing tutorial. The ME2066 is my third design for Nomi patterns, and it's going to come out sometime in January of next year for their early spring collection. This video tutorial that I'm working on is the sew along video that's going to be linked to the pattern. The sewing sequence that's presented in a video tutorial is organized in a way that helps someone who's sewing the dress for the very first time to understand and to follow. But since I designed the dress and I've already sewn the dress once, my goal in sewing is to try to make my process as efficient as possible. The key to making the whole process of sewing efficient is batching. Now, because this is a color block design, there are two fabric colors involved, and the most straightforward way to go about cutting up the fabric is to start with one fabric color first and then move on to the next one. And that is why I have the fabric pieces in different piles. Over here, I have a pile of fabric pieces over here in red. This is going to be the contrast, and all the pieces in pink are the main fabric. So I spent most of my yesterday cutting up all the fabric pieces that I need to sew up the dress, and today I'm gonna finally get started with sewing. This morning I spent quite a bit of time applying the interfacing to all the pieces that require interfacing, and before I actually get started with sewing, I'm gonna have to clean up this table and set up my sewing machine right here. I am also going to start stacking the fabric pieces in the sequence in which I'm going to sew them, so I get as many seams sewn in one single sitting at the sewing machine. To make my stack, I started off by pairing the fabric pieces that go together. For example, the bodice side front and the bodice front need to be stacked together for me to sew the front princess seam. During the initial stage of stacking, I pick out the pieces that I'm going to sew first. So these pieces are actually at the bottom of the stack. But after this, I go through the entire stack again to pin the fabric pieces together. So by the end of it, the order of the stack is reversed, and the first fabric pieces that I want to sew are now at the top of the stack. Now, this is definitely not required and purely vanity on my part, but I like to pick out the pins with the colors that go with my current sewing project. And over here I have pink, red, and pearly white. It just makes me feel happier. Usually for the first round of sewing, I start off by sewing stay stitches along the front and back neckline first. So once I get that out of the way, I get to switch the stitch length back to regular stitch length for the rest of my sewing. When batch sewing, I also try to do continuous sewing and minimize the cutting of thread between the seams to reduce thread waste. So when batch sewing, usually my goal is to not have to pick up the seam ripper at all. And I'm so close to getting all the seams for this sewing session sewn up without having to unpick anything. And then for the last two fabric pieces, I actually put the two wrong seams together, and now I gotta unpick it. Unpicking slows down the process, but I mean, sometimes it is necessary. After sewing all the seams here, I went on to trim every single seam with pinking shears and pressed every single seam. This prepares my dress for the next step of the sewing process and also helps to give my dress a neat, professional finish. So here is the beauty of batching the process. By the time I was done with my first round of sewing, I basically have half of the dress put together. One of the key design features of this dress is the top stitching that is made on almost every single seam. Now in the ideal world, having a second sewing machine that is dedicated to the task of top stitching will make the entire process of sewing this dress a lot more efficient, because it means that you don't have to keep switching the top thread from the regular sewing thread to the top stitching thread, and you also don't have to keep switching the needle from regular needle to top stitching needle. And of course, that saves a lot of time. Unfortunately, I've been experiencing a lot of timing, tension type issues with this machine, and it's gonna just take too long for me to kind of fiddle with it and figure it out. So I am going to proceed without this machine. For the denim blue version of the dress, I used a classic gold tone top stitching thread, and for this red and pink color block version, I'm having a little bit of dilemma. First of all, I didn't plan ahead of time, so I actually don't have any special top stitching thread purchased for this project, but I know using 2 strands of regular sewing thread is a good substitute for a top stitching thread. So I can make do with that. I have 2 options. I have 2 shades of red thread available. So to help myself decide on the best shade of red to use for the top stitching for this design, I sewed 2 tiny samples for comparison. I used bright red for one version and a deeper burgundy red for the second version. Which one would you choose? After I was done with this round of top stitching, I switched my top thread back to my regular pink sewing thread to get my machine ready for another round of sewing. Just like before, I stacked and pinned the fabric pieces together in the order that they needed to go together. And then I did a round of batch sewing, a round of batch trimming, a round of pressing, and another round of top stitching. At this stage, I started working on really putting the bodice together and switched my thread from the light pink of the main fabric to the bright red of the contrast fabric, since the sleeves and the yoke pieces are in red. If you're expecting the rest of the sewing process to continue swimmingly in this same manner, with me batching every step of the way until I was done with sewing the dress, yeah, it didn't happen that way. This is the point where I really started working on perfecting the finishing touches, like sewing the exposed zipper, which is the most time-consuming and, in my opinion, the trickiest part of sewing this dress. The 6 rows of top stitching, which was a prolonged period of intense concentration. Sewing the belt and the carriers, which involved some precision hand sewing and hand cranking. And usually 2 tries to get things perfect. I think I kind of got worn out towards the end. It's the combination of trying to figure out how to do top stitching properly with 2 strands of regular thread, which isn't as simple and as straightforward as you think, unfortunately, and also trying to sew and finish the dress by the deadline. I know I started this video with hopeful optimism about how you can batch your way through the entire process and be like a super efficient sewing superstar, but it is a handcraft after all. We are making something by hand, and at the end of the day, when we are making something by hand and when our goal is to have something that is as perfect as possible and built to last, it is just not going to be a linear process. We are, after all, humans, and this is an expression of our creativity and imagination, and we should be allowed to take some time and slow down and enjoy the process. So how are you balancing efficiency, accuracy, and speed? Leave a comment and let me know which one of these you're focusing on in your craft, like sewing or knitting at the moment. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up because it really goes a long way in supporting my channel. The sewing pattern is actually already out on the simplicity.com website. Link to that will be added to the description box. I will also be adding my sew along video to my own channel with a new intro and outro, and then you can watch that and kind of compare and see the differences between behind the scenes and sewing tutorial process. Subscribe for more sewing, DIY, and style, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!